The bread is already rising when the sky is still black. In a small stone building near the edge of town, a baker named Modestus is awake before almost anyone else in the city. He does not know his name matters to anyone, and he never will in any grand sense. He is simply a man doing what he does every single morning of his life. He pulls a wooden paddle from beside the oven and checks the coals, nudging them with the tip of an iron rod until they glow the way he wants them to glow. The air smells like ash and warm flour. Somewhere behind him, a dog stretches and resettles near the doorway, waiting for scraps that will come later once the ovens are full and the first loaves are pulled. He has done this every morning for years. He will do it again tomorrow, or so he believes. Outside, the streets of his town are quiet in that particular way that only exists in the hour before dawn, not silent exactly, but hushed, holding its breath. A cartwheel creaks somewhere 2 streets over. A rooster tries its voice and gives up. In the harbor below the town, small waves lap against the hulls of fishing boats that will go out again today, just as they went out yesterday, just as they will not go out tomorrow. Above all of this, quiet and dark against the paling sky, sits a green, gently sloped mountain that the people of this town have always simply called Vesuvius. They grow grapes on its lower slopes. They graze goats along its ridges. They have never once in any living memory thought of it as anything other than a mountain. They are wrong. And within about a day, nearly everything about this quiet town, its ovens, its bakers, its dogs, its mountain will be gone, buried so completely that it will take almost 17 centuries for anyone to find it again. This is the story of that town's last morning. It is called Pompeii. Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. If you found your way to this video, I hope it means you're somewhere comfortable right now. Maybe already in bed, maybe just settling in for the night, maybe with the lights low and something warm nearby. That's exactly the kind of evening this story was written for. There's no need to follow along closely or remember every detail. You're welcome to simply let your mind drift along with the voice and the images, and if you fall asleep partway through, that's perfectly fine. That's actually the whole idea. Before we begin, if you don't mind, I'd love to know 2 small things. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are right now? I always find it strange and lovely to imagine this story reaching so many different time zones at once, someone just waking up in one part of the world while someone else is drifting off to sleep in another. If you'd like, leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy this kind of long, slow journey into the past, consider subscribing, so more evenings like this one can find their way to you. Now let's settle back in, because the story of Pompeii doesn't begin with fire falling from the sky. It begins, like most days in most places throughout history, with people simply going about their lives, with no idea that anything unusual is coming at all. A city waking up long before the mountain made itself known, Pompeii was already many centuries old. By the summer we're about to spend there, the town had existed in some form for roughly 700 years. It sat on a low plateau of hardened lava from some ancient, forgotten eruption, close enough to the Bay of Naples that the smell of salt water drifted through its streets on the right kind of wind. The Sarno River curled nearby, useful for trade, useful for irrigation, useful for the small boats that carried goods up from the coast. By the year we're interested in, the town belonged to Rome, part of the vast and increasingly comfortable Roman world under the Emperor Titus, who had only recently come to power after the death of his father, Vespasian. Pompeii itself, though, was not a grand imperial capital. It was something more ordinary and in some ways more interesting. A mid-sized regional town, prosperous but not glamorous, home to perhaps 11,000 people. Give or take, historians still argue over the exact number, since so much depends on how you count the enslaved population, and the honest answer is that we simply don't have a precise census to point to. What we do know, because the town itself eventually told us, is that Pompeii in these final years was a place that took its daily rhythms seriously. The streets were paved with polygonal blocks of volcanic stone, worn smooth and grooved by generations of cart wheels, the ruts so consistent that you can still trace exactly where wagons habitually rolled if you look closely enough at the streets today. Raised stepping stones cross the roads at intervals, allowing pedestrians to cross without stepping into the runoff and waste that collected there, while carts could still pass by rolling their wheels through the gaps between the stones. It was, in its own unglamorous way, a small piece of very practical engineering, repeated at nearly every intersection in town. As the sky lightens, sounds begin layering on top of each other the way they do in any town waking up. A blacksmith somewhere near the Forum starts his fire, and the first ringing strikes of metal on metal echo faintly down the street. Shutters are unlatched and folded back from shop fronts. Somewhere, a woman is sweeping a stone threshold, the same threshold her family has swept every morning for who knows how many years. Public fountains fed by the town's aqueduct system are already busy, not with drama, just the ordinary business of jars being filled, gossip being exchanged, and someone's child being told again not to lean over the edge. There is something worth sitting with here, something easy to miss if we move too quickly toward the volcano. Nobody in Pompeii on this particular morning is thinking about disaster. They are thinking about bread, about debts, about whether it will rain. About an argument with a neighbor over a shared wall, or a letter that needs to be sent to a cousin in Rome, or whether the fish at the market will be fresh enough to be worth the price being asked. This is what makes their story, in a strange way, so quietly moving. It is not a story about people who sensed something coming. It is a story about people who did not, living lives that felt, to them, completely unremarkable. And it's worth remembering that Pompeii was not an isolated town cut off from the wider world. Ships came and went constantly from its port at the mouth of the Sarno, carrying wine, garum, the pungent fermented fish sauce so beloved across the Roman world, and locally made goods out into the Mediterranean, while bringing back grain, luxury items, and news from Rome and beyond. A person walking through the Forum that morning might have overheard talk of imperial politics, of a fire that had swept through Rome the year before under Titus, of gladiatorial games being planned, layered right alongside far more local concerns about crop yields and family disputes. Pompeii, in other words, felt itself connected to a much larger world, never suspecting that the ground directly beneath its feet held a much more immediate danger than anything happening in the capital. The mountain that wasn't supposed to be dangerous, if you had asked anyone in Pompeii that morning what Vesuvius was, they would have described a mountain, green almost to its summit, its lower slopes covered in vineyards that produced a wine locals were rather proud of. They might have mentioned that the soil up there was unusually good for growing grapes, dark and rich, though they wouldn't have known why. They would not have called it a volcano, because as far as anyone alive could remember, it had never behaved like one. This is one of the strange, quiet tragedies at the heart of this story. Vesuvius had erupted before, catastrophically, roughly 1,700 years earlier, in an eruption so old that no human memory or written record of it survived into the 1st century. The people of Pompeii were living, without knowing it, in the crater's own volcanic soil farming ground that had been laid down by the very kind of event that was about to happen again. Geologists today, digging beneath the layers from 79 AD, have found evidence of that earlier eruption, along with signs that the mountain had rumbled and shifted more than once across the centuries in between, just not with anything the local population would have recognized as a warning. There had, however, been one unmistakable sign 17 years before our story that something was not entirely at peace beneath the region. In the year 62 AD, a powerful earthquake struck Pompeii and the surrounding towns, causing serious damage. Buildings cracked, statues toppled. A relief carving that survives today, from the house of a banker named Caecilius Eucundus, shows the Temple of Jupiter in the Forum visibly lining, its columns tilted at an angle, seemingly created specifically to commemorate the damage from that earthquake. Some ancient writers, including the philosopher Seneca, wrote about the event, and Seneca himself speculated at length about the natural causes of earthquakes, without ever imagining they might be connected to the mountain looming over the bay. By the summer we're describing, 17 years had passed since that earthquake, and much of Pompeii was still, quite literally, under construction. Wander through certain neighborhoods that morning and you would have found buildings mid-repair, scaffolding still in place in some corners of town, the house of the chaste lovers among the buildings still being restored. In a strange way, the town had never fully finished healing from the last disaster it associated with the ground shaking, and would go on to be interrupted by an entirely different kind of disaster before the repairs were done. In the days leading up to the eruption, we know from later accounts and from modern seismological study that smaller earthquakes had been shaking the region again, more frequently than usual. But this is a detail that requires an important, honest caveat. Minor tremors were common enough in this part of Italy that most residents likely didn't think much of them. Pliny the Younger, whose later letters give us our best surviving eyewitness account of the eruption, mentioned these tremors almost as an afterthought, noting that they were frequent in Campania and rarely caused alarm. In other words, the ground had been quietly, persistently trying to say something for days, and almost nobody was in a position to understand what it meant. What the market sounded like by the time the sun is fully up, the heart of Pompeii is the Forum, a long rectangular plaza lined with columns, temples, and the town's most important civic buildings. This is where the business of the city happens, where politics and commerce and religion all sit within a few dozen paces of each other, and on an ordinary summer morning, it would have been filled with noise and motion. Vendors set up stalls selling bread, vegetables, cheese, and cured meats. The Macelum, the town's covered meat and fish market just off the Forum, would already be busy, with its distinctive round central structure and stalls arranged for the sale of fresh fish, brought up that morning from boats along the coast. Historians have found fish bones and even the remains of sea urchins in the drains beneath this market, a small, oddly moving detail that tells us something about what people were eating on ordinary days, even the very last one. Prices were haggled over loudly, the way they are haggled over in open markets everywhere and in every era. A jar of wine might be examined and rejected as watered down. A cut of meat might be held up to the light and questioned. Money changed hands in the form of bronze, silver, and occasionally gold coins, many bearing the faces of past and present emperors, a small daily reminder of just how far Roman authority reached, even into a town that most people in Rome itself had probably never heard of and would never visit. Graffiti covered many of the walls nearby, an aspect of Pompeii that continues to surprise modern visitors precisely because it feels so unexpectedly familiar. People scratched their names into plaster. They left notes to friends, insults toward rivals, declarations of love, complaints about innkeepers, and endorsements for local political candidates, since election season brought out enthusiastic, sometimes very colorful campaign slogans painted directly onto storefronts. One piece of surviving graffiti simply reads, in essence, that a person named Restituta ought to remove her jewelry and reveal her natural beauty. Another complains about a fuller, a laundry worker, allegedly urinating in the street. These aren't the words of a civilization performing history for the benefit of future observers. They are the words of ordinary, occasionally petty, entirely human people, arguing about the same small things people argue about now. It's worth pausing here on something easy to overlook: the sheer diversity of who filled these streets. Pompeii's population included wealthy landowners and their families, freed slaves who had built successful businesses of their own, enslaved workers with no legal freedom at all, foreign merchants who had settled locally, and skilled craftsmen whose family workshops had operated for generations. This wasn't a town of uniform Roman citizens in white togas, the image many people carry from old paintings. It was a working port town, its streets filled with a genuine mixture of languages, accents, and backgrounds, all moving through the same narrow, sun-baked passageways on their way to work. Behind the walls of a wealthy home, step away from the noise of the market for a moment, and walk instead through the doorway of one of Pompeii's larger houses, and the whole texture of the morning changes. A wealthy Roman home, called a domus, was built inward rather than outward, presenting a fairly plain, even blank exterior to the street, with most of its beauty hidden from public view. Passing through the entrance corridor, you would step into the atrium, an open central hall with a rectangular opening in the roof called the compluvium, positioned directly above a shallow basin in the floor known as the impluvium, designed to collect rainwater. On a clear summer morning like this one, sunlight would pour through that opening, lighting the space below in a way that must have felt almost theatrical, especially against painted walls that Pompeian households favored in deep reds, ochres, and blacks, decorated with mythological scenes, garden landscapes, and architectural illusions so skillfully done that they tricked the eye into seeing depth where there was only flat plaster. The household would already be stirring by this hour, though the rhythm of that stirring depended entirely on your place within it. The paterfamilias, the male head of the household, might be receiving early morning visitors known as clients, men of lower social standing who depended on his patronage and were expected to appear at his home each morning to pay respects, seek favors, or simply be seen supporting him publicly, a ritual called the salutatio. This exchange of loyalty and obligation formed one of the quiet threads holding Roman social life together, largely invisible to us now unless we specifically look for it. Meanwhile, enslaved household members had likely been awake far longer than anyone else in the home, since someone needed to have fires lit, water fetched, and food prepared before the family themselves woke. Roman households of any real wealth relied enormously on enslaved labor, and it is worth being honest and clear about this rather than softening it. Enslaved people cooked, cleaned, raised children, managed finances, and performed skilled labor throughout Pompeii, With no legal personhood of their own, their daily experience largely absent from the written record precisely because writing was a privilege they were rarely permitted or taught. When we admire the beauty of a Pompeian villa today, it's worth remembering that its comfort was built and maintained by people whose names, in most cases, we will simply never know. Children in wealthier households, meanwhile, might be beginning lessons with a private tutor, often themselves an educated enslaved person or freedman, learning to read Latin, and for the more privileged, some Greek as well, since fluency in Greek carried real cultural prestige across the Roman world. Their handwriting practice, preserved by chance in a few surviving wax tablets from the region, shows the same uneven, effortful lettering you'd expect from any child anywhere, in any century, still learning to hold a stylus properly. The smell of the strets, if you could actually walk through Pompeii on this particular morning, one of the first things you might notice before anything visual would be the smell. Roman cities were not gentle on the senses, and Pompeii was no exception. Without modern plumbing, waste from chamber pots was often tossed into the street or collected for later disposal, sometimes even used in the tanning and fulling industries, which relied on stale urine as a cleaning agent for wool and leather. Fulling workshops, where wool cloth was cleaned, treated, and whitened, were common enough in Pompeii that their pungent smell would have drifted into nearby streets on certain mornings. Combine that with animal waste from the mules, horses, and oxen constantly pulling carts through town, smoke from countless cooking fires and bakery ovens, and the salty tang carried up from the harbor, and you begin to understand that Pompeii's sensory experience was rich, layered, and not always pleasant, in the way that any working, breathing, pre-modern city tends to be. And yet alongside those harsher smells were others far more comforting. Bread baking in stone ovens across the city. Garum being ladled from clay containers in food shops. Herbs and spices sold in the market, cumin, coriander, and imported pepper for those wealthy enough to afford it. Wine being poured from large storage vessels called dolia into smaller jugs for household use. Flowers cultivated in courtyard gardens, their scent occasionally drifting out into the street through an open doorway. Pompeii's food culture, in fact, has left behind an unusually vivid record, largely because the eruption sealed so much organic material so quickly that traces of actual meals survived nearly 2,000 years. Archaeologists working in Pompeii's Thermopolia, the small fast food counters found on many street corners, have identified traces of duck, goat, fish, snails, and even, in one memorable and widely reported case, a partially eaten meal still sitting where it had been left, an ordinary lunch interrupted by an extraordinary catastrophe. These counters, built directly into the street-facing walls of buildings, held large ceramic jars called dolia set into stone counters, which kept food warm or ready for quick serving to workers who didn't have time, money, or kitchen space to cook a full meal at home. In many ways, they weren't so different from grabbing a quick bite from a street vendor today, and it's genuinely striking how familiar that particular rhythm of urban life still feels. Voices in the Forum by mid-morning, the Forum would have filled further still, and here it's worth slowing down to think about what Roman civic life actually looked like in a town this size, rather than picturing something as grand as Rome itself. Pompeii had its own local government, run by elected officials called duumviri, essentially two men who served as the town's chief magistrates, along with aediles, who oversaw public buildings, markets, and civic order. Elections were a genuine event in town life, with wealthy citizens sponsoring campaigns for favored candidates and painted electoral notices, some of which still survive on Pompeii's walls today, endorsing particular men for office, occasionally with the backing of specific trade groups. Bakers, it turns out, sometimes publicly endorsed candidates, as did fruit sellers, muleteers, and even, in one famous and slightly cheeky example, a group whose endorsement historians believe may have actually been intended as a joke or an insult toward the candidate rather than genuine support, since the group in question had a somewhat disreputable public reputation. Basilica buildings near the Forum served as spaces for legal proceedings and business transactions, essentially early courthouses and commercial exchanges rolled into one covered space. A person with a financial dispute might have found themselves there this very morning, waiting for a magistrate's attention, nervously rehearsing what they intended to say, entirely unaware that the argument they were so anxious about would, within about 24 hours, mean absolutely nothing at all. Religion, too, was woven inseparably into civic life here, in a way that can be difficult for modern audiences to fully appreciate, since Romans generally didn't separate religious and political life the way many societies do today. The Temple of Jupiter stood prominently at one end of the Forum, still showing repair work from the earthquake 17 years earlier. The Temple of Apollo, older still, sat nearby, its rituals older than the town's incorporation into the Roman state itself. Household worship, too, continued constantly and quietly in private homes throughout the city, where families maintained small shrines called Lareria, dedicated to household guardian spirits known as the Lares, believed to protect the home and its occupants. A person passing through their own atrium that morning might have paused, almost without thinking about it, to leave a small offering, perhaps a bit of food, perhaps just a murmured word, the kind of small, automatic religious gesture that structured Roman domestic life, the way checking a phone structures so much of ours today. Water, heat, and the baths as the morning gives way toward midday, and the summer heat begins to properly settle over the town. Thoughts across Pompeii would naturally have turned toward the baths. Public bathing was one of the great shared rituals of Roman urban life, cutting across class lines in ways surprisingly few other institutions did. Pompeii had several public bath complexes, the Stabian baths among the oldest and largest, offering separate facilities for men and women, along with a sequence of rooms kept at different temperatures, the Frigidarium for cold bathing, the Tepidarium for a gentler, warmer transition, and the Caldarium, heated by an ingenious underfloor system called a hypocaust, where hot air from furnaces circulated beneath raised floors and through hollow wall spaces to keep the room and its water genuinely hot. For a few coins, almost anyone in Pompeii could access this experience, meaning that a poor laborer and a moderately wealthy merchant might, at certain hours, be soaking in the very same heated pool, an extraordinary kind of social leveling that existed almost nowhere else in Roman daily life. Slaves, however, would typically have been accompanying their owners rather than bathing as equals, tending to clothing, oils, and strigils, the curved metal tools used to scrape sweat, oil, and dirt from the skin, since soap as we understand it today wasn't in common use. The baths were as much social spaces as hygienic ones. People gossiped there, conducted informal business there, exercised in adjoining palestra courtyards, and simply spent hours of unhurried time there in a way that feels, honestly, almost enviable from the perspective of our much more rushed modern lives. If Pompeii had a version of a town square where news actually traveled, informally and quickly, from person to person, it was very likely the baths, at least as much as the Forum itself. By late morning on this particular day, some of Pompeii's residents may already have been settling into that familiar, unhurried rhythm, entirely unaware that time itself, for their town, had already quietly begun running out. The hands that built the town, every city runs on the labor of people whose names rarely survive, and Pompeii was no different. Along many of its narrow side streets, workshops opened directly onto the pavement, their fronts unshuttered to let in light and air, and to let passers-by see and hopefully purchase whatever was being made inside. Metalworkers hammered out tools, fittings, and small decorative items. Potters shaped everyday storage vessels and fine tableware alike. Carpenters built furniture, doors, and the wooden fittings that held together buildings whose stone and brick frames still stand today, even though nearly all their wood has long since vanished, burned away in the heat of the eruption, or rotted in the centuries since. Textile production, in particular, occupied an enormous amount of Pompeii's economic life. Wool was cleaned, dyed, woven, and finished within the town, supporting an entire community of specialized workers, from spinners to weavers to the fullones, or fullers, who treated finished cloth in large stone vats using a mixture of water, clay, and, as mentioned earlier, stale urine collected specifically for this purpose from public and private sources around town. It's a detail that tends to surprise people, and understandably so, but it points to something important about ancient economies. Nothing genuinely useful went to waste, no matter how unglamorous its origin. Bakeries like the one belonging to our baker Modestus from the opening of this story were common throughout Pompeii, and archaeologists have identified more than 30 of them within the town's walls, many still containing their large stone mills, shaped like hourglasses, which were turned by donkeys or by enslaved laborers to grind grain into flour. One particularly well-preserved bakery, believed to belong to a man named Modestus, still contained loaves of bread, carbonized but remarkably intact, sitting inside its oven at the moment excavators finally opened it centuries later. Those loaves stamped with a baker's mark before baking, a common Roman practice used to identify ownership among ovens sometimes shared by multiple households, remain some of the most quietly moving objects ever recovered from the site, a piece of someone's ordinary Tuesday, preserved by catastrophe. Beyond the workshops, Pompeii's economy depended heavily on its agricultural surroundings. Vineyards on the fertile volcanic slopes of Vesuvius itself produced wine that was, by several ancient accounts, well regarded, exported as far as Gaul and other Roman provinces. Olive groves supplied oil for cooking, lighting, and bathing. Garum production, meanwhile, was a genuinely significant local industry, with fermenting vats found throughout the town, and one particular Pompeian producer, a man named Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, seems to have run something close to a garum empire, his name and trademark appearing on mosaic floors and shipping containers, found not just in Pompeii, but across the wider Mediterranean world, a reminder that branding and commercial pride are hardly modern inventions. What people wore clothing in Pompeii reflected status, occupation, and circumstance just as clearly as it does in any era, though perhaps with less variety than we're used to today, since climate, cost of materials, and social convention all narrowed the range of practical options. Of citizen status, when appearing in formal or civic settings, might wear a toga, that heavy, carefully draped wool garment that required real skill to arrange properly, and was, by most accounts, not especially comfortable in the Italian summer heat. For this reason, everyday wear for most men, citizen or not, tended to be a simpler tunic, a basic garment belted at the waist, made of wool or, for those who could afford it, lighter linen, better suited to actual daily movement and labor. Women wore a stola over an underlying tunic, a longer garment that fell to the ankles, sometimes topped with a palla, a large rectangular shawl that could be draped over the shoulders or pulled up over the head, both for warmth and for modesty in public settings. Wealthier women accessorized with jewelry, much of which survives today precisely because people, in their final desperate moments, sometimes tried to grab their most valuable possessions before fleeing, only to be caught by the eruption before they could get away, their jewelry preserved alongside them. Dye color carried meaning and cost. Purple, derived from a labor-intensive process involving Mediterranean sea snails, remained extraordinarily expensive and was associated with high status, sometimes legally restricted to certain officials. More affordable dyes came from plants and minerals, producing yellows, reds, and blues that would have added considerable color to Pompeii's streets, contrary to the faded, monochrome image people often carry of the ancient world, thanks to centuries of looking at unpainted marble statues and stone ruins. In reality, ancient sculpture and architecture were often painted in vivid colors, and Pompeii's frescoes, remarkably preserved by ash and pumice, still show us some of that original color today, a vivid reminder of just how much visual richness has simply been lost to time everywhere else. Footwear ranged from simple leather sandals for everyday wear to sturdier, closed shoes suitable for travel or work. Enslaved people and the very poor sometimes went barefoot, a detail visible in some surviving artwork and inferred from certain skeletal evidence found at the site, where foot bones show wear patterns consistent with a lifetime spent walking without proper protective footwear. Childhood in a Roman town, children moved through Pompeii's streets much as children move through any town, though their lives were shaped by circumstances quite different from what a modern audience might expect. Infant mortality was tragically high by modern standards, and families understood, in a way that feels almost unbearable to imagine now, that a significant portion of children born would not survive to adulthood. This shaped, though certainly did not eliminate, the emotional experience of parenthood, and surviving funerary inscriptions from across the Roman world make clear that grief for lost children was every bit as devastating and heartfelt then as it is now, expressed in genuinely tender, personal language that closes the emotional distance of 2,000 years almost instantly when you actually read it. For those children who did survive early infancy, daily life involved a mixture of play, chores, and for those whose families could afford it, some degree of formal education. Wealthier boys typically began formal schooling around age 7, studying under a literator for basic literacy and numeracy, before potentially moving on to more advanced study of literature, rhetoric, and, for the most privileged, philosophy. Girls from wealthier families sometimes received similar early education, though it was far less common for them to continue into more advanced studies, since their expected life path generally centered on marriage and household management rather than public or professional life. Poorer children, and certainly enslaved children, received little to no formal education at all, instead being put to work as soon as they were physically able, helping with household tasks, running errands, or assisting in family workshops and trades. Toys found throughout Pompeii and the surrounding region, though, remind us that childhood still contained genuine play regardless of class. Small clay dolls, miniature furniture, marbles, and knucklebones, a game played with small animal bones tossed and caught in various patterns, remarkably similar to games still played by children in some parts of the world today. It's worth pausing on this thought for a moment, quietly, without rushing past it. Among the plaster casts later made from voids left by decomposed bodies in the hardened ash, some of the most affecting are those of children, caught in poses that suggest they were being held, protected, or carried by adults in their final moments. We'll return to this later in the story, but it felt important to plant the thought here now early, while these children are still simply playing in the street, still simply alive, still simply unaware. Entertainment and the Amphitheater Pompeii took its entertainment seriously, perhaps more seriously than a town of its size might have needed to, and nowhere is that clearer than in its amphitheater, one of the oldest surviving stone amphitheaters anywhere in the Roman world, built more than a century before the eruption. Gladiatorial games were held here periodically, drawing crowds not just from Pompeii itself, but from surrounding towns as well, since these events were genuinely major social occasions, advertised weeks in advance through painted notices on walls throughout the region, some of which specifically survive today, listing the names of gladiators, the number of combat pairs expected, and sometimes even promising amenities like awnings for shade or scented water sprinkled through the crowd. Small comforts meant to draw in a paying, sweating audience during the hottest parts of the year. In fact, one of the more colorful episodes in Pompeii's relatively recent history, before the eruption, involved this very amphitheater. In the year 59 AD, a violent riot broke out between Pompeian spectators and visitors from the neighboring town of Nuceria during a gladiatorial event, escalating into serious injuries and deaths. The incident was significant enough that it reached the attention of the Roman Senate, which responded by banning gladiatorial games in Pompeii for a full decade, a punishment that must have felt genuinely painful to a town so invested in this particular form of public spectacle. A wall painting discovered in a nearby house actually depicts the riot itself, showing the amphitheater, the surrounding vendor stalls, and the chaotic fighting, offering us a rare visual record of a specific, dated historical event from an ordinary Roman provincial town. Beyond gladiatorial combat, Pompeii also had a theater complex for more traditional dramatic and musical performances, including a smaller, more intimate Odeon suited to poetry readings, musical recitals, and smaller theatrical works. Roman comedy, often broad and physical, along with tragedy adapted from Greek originals, would have been performed here, giving the town's residents access to genuine cultural and artistic life without needing to travel to a larger city. Beyond formal, ticketed entertainment, ordinary recreation filled the town's daily rhythm in smaller, quieter ways too. board games similar to modern checkers or backgammon were popular, played on boards scratched directly into stone benches and pavement in public spaces, some of which still survive, worn smooth by generations of idle hands during idle hours. Dice games, often played for small stakes, were common enough that gambling disputes occasionally appear in surviving graffiti, including at least one memorable complaint about a dice game gone wrong, scratched permanently into a wall by someone who was clearly still irritated about it. The harbor and the wider world Pompeii's relationship with the sea deserves its own quiet moment of attention, because it shaped nearly everything about how the town understood itself. Though the modern coastline has shifted significantly since antiquity, due to sediment deposits and changes caused by the eruption itself, in the 1st century Pompeii sat much closer to open water, with a functioning river port near the mouth of the Sarno that connected the town directly to Mediterranean shipping routes. Goods flowed in both directions here, local wine, garum, and manufactured goods heading outward, while grain, marble, exotic foodstuffs, and luxury items from across the empire and beyond flowed inward. This maritime connection meant Pompeii's population included a genuinely cosmopolitan mix of people passing through or settling permanently, sailors and merchants from other parts of Italy, from Greece, from North Africa, and from the Eastern Mediterranean, bringing with them different languages, religious practices, and goods. Evidence of Egyptian religious influence, for instance, appears clearly in Pompeii, including a well-preserved temple of Isis, reflecting the genuine popularity that certain imported Egyptian religious cults enjoyed throughout the Roman world during this period, offering their initiates promises of personal salvation and mystical experience that traditional Roman civic religion, focused more on communal ritual and political order, didn't really provide in the same way. Ships in the harbor that morning would have included small local fishing vessels heading out for the day's catch, larger merchant ships loading or unloading cargo, and possibly naval vessels as well, since the Roman fleet based at nearby Misenum, under the command of a middle-aged scholar and admiral named Pliny the Elder, patrolled these waters regularly. It's worth noting his presence here now, quietly, because within about 24 hours, Pliny the Elder's own scientific curiosity about the very eruption we're building toward will lead him directly into its path, in an episode that has become one of history's most famous and most poignant examples of a person dying in pursuit of understanding something almost nobody else around him could yet comprehend. What historians still argue about its worth taking a moment here, roughly at the story's midpoint, to acknowledge something important and honest about how we actually know what we know about Pompeii. For a long time, the eruption of Vesuvius was confidently dated to August 24th, based primarily on a single surviving manuscript tradition of a letter written by Pliny the Younger to the historian Tacitus decades after the event, in which he described the date his uncle died during the disaster. This date, August 24th, 79 AD, became so deeply embedded in popular understanding of Pompeii that it appeared, unquestioned, in textbooks and documentaries for generations. However, over the past several decades, a growing body of archaeological evidence has cast real doubt on that traditional date. Excavators have found people apparently wearing warmer clothing than would be expected in the height of a Campanian summer. Fresh fall fruits and nuts have been recovered, that would be more typical of an autumn harvest. Perhaps most strikingly, in 2018, archaeologists discovered a charcoal inscription in a house under excavation, seemingly written shortly before the eruption, bearing a date corresponding to mid-October, a piece of evidence that, because charcoal is fragile and would likely have worn away if written earlier in the year, strongly suggests the eruption may have actually occurred later in the year than October rather than August, possibly around October 24th instead. This matters, honestly, not because the exact date changes the emotional core of the story, but because it's a genuinely good example of how historical understanding continues to evolve, even about events as extensively studied as this one. Manuscript traditions can introduce copying errors over centuries of transcription, a single digit shifted by a scribe somewhere along the way, and archaeology sometimes offers us physical evidence that written testimony, however sincere, simply cannot. For the purposes of this story, we'll continue referring to the traditional late August dating, since it remains the most commonly cited version and the one most listeners will recognize. But it felt important to be honest with you that serious, ongoing scholarly debate exists about this very basic fact, and that historical certainty, even about famous, well-documented events, is often far less solid than popular retellings tend to suggest. A quiet moment at midday before we move any further into this story. Let's slow down together for a moment, because Pompeii's last ordinary hours deserve to be felt, not just narrated. Picture the sun near its highest point, the heat settling heavily over red tile roofs and pale stone walls. In a shaded garden courtyard somewhere near the center of town, water trickles softly from a small fountain shaped like a dolphin, one of the modest domestic luxuries that even moderately prosperous households enjoyed. Somewhere nearby, cicadas hum steadily in the warm air, that particular droning sound of a Mediterranean summer that hasn't changed in 2,000 years, still exactly the same today as it was then. A woman sits in the shade of a covered walkway, mending a torn hem, her fingers moving without needing to look, her mind somewhere else entirely, perhaps on a meal to prepare, perhaps on nothing at all. A dog dozes nearby in a strip of shadow, twitching occasionally at some private dream. Somewhere down the street, a mule cart has stopped so its driver can rest in the shade for a few minutes, wiping sweat from his forehead with a forearm, his cart still loaded with amphorae of oil bound for a shop near the Forum. This is what most of history actually is, if we're honest with ourselves. Not battles, not speeches, not decrees, but small, unremarkable moments like this one, repeated endlessly, barely noticed even by the people living through them. It's part of why Pompeii continues to fascinate people so deeply, even now. It didn't preserve a triumph or a monument built specifically to be remembered. It preserved a completely ordinary Tuesday, or perhaps a completely ordinary October afternoon, frozen exactly as it was, mid-breath, without any warning that it needed to matter. And somewhere beneath all of this stillness, deep under the mountain a few miles away, pressure had been building for centuries, patient in a way nothing human ever really is. Early warning, misunderstood by early afternoon, according to the account later written by Pliny the Younger, who was staying with his mother and his uncle Pliny the Elder across the bay at Misenum. Something began happening on the mountain that no one in the region had a framework to properly interpret. Pliny the Younger, who was 17 at the time and would go on to become a respected lawyer, magistrate, and prolific letter writer, described his mother first noticing an unusual cloud rising from the direction of Vesuvius, one unlike any weather formation people were used to seeing. His uncle, ever the naturalist, went to a slightly higher vantage point to get a better look, immediately intrigued rather than alarmed. Pliny the Younger later described the shape of the cloud, using a comparison that has become genuinely famous among historians and volcanologists alike. He said it resembled the shape of an umbrella pine tree, or a stone pine, common throughout the Italian landscape, rising on what he described as a very tall trunk before spreading outward at the top into branches. That description turns out to be remarkably, almost eerily accurate in scientific terms. Modern volcanology now uses the term Plinian eruption specifically in honor of this account, describing exactly the kind of eruption Pliny witnessed. A powerful, sustained column of gas, ash, and pumice blasted violently upward into the stratosphere, rising for miles before spreading laterally into a broad, mushroom-like cap, driven by high-altitude winds. A 17-year-old, watching from roughly 18 miles away with no scientific vocabulary for what he was witnessing, managed to describe the physical shape of the phenomenon so precisely that his words are still used as its technical scientific classification, nearly 2,000 years later. Meanwhile, back in Pompeii itself, much closer to the mountain, residents would have experienced this initial phase very differently than the more distant observers across the bay. The sky above Vesuvius would have darkened dramatically as ash and pumice began falling, lightly at first, then with increasing intensity, coating rooftops, streets, and gardens in a fine gray dust, not unlike a strange, warm, unseasonal snowfall. The first hours of ash as the afternoon wore on, what had begun as an odd curiosity in the sky above Vesuvius became something impossible for anyone in Pompeii to ignore. Pumice, the lightweight, porous volcanic rock formed when gas-rich magma cools rapidly, began falling from the sky in genuinely alarming quantities, pale gray stones ranging from pebble-sized fragments to pieces several inches across, accumulating on rooftops, in streets, and against walls with steadily increasing depth. Roofs across town, many built with wooden beams supporting heavy terracotta tiles, began groaning and in some cases collapsing entirely under the accumulating weight, especially as the fall continued for hour after hour without any sign of stopping. For the people of Pompeii, this must have been a genuinely confusing, disorienting experience, since nothing in their collective memory or cultural understanding offered them a clear script for what was happening or what to do about it. Some residents, according to the physical evidence later uncovered by archaeologists, chose to remain in their homes initially, perhaps believing this was a severe but survivable storm of some kind, something that would eventually pass the way heavy weather generally does. Sheltering indoors, unfortunately, put people directly at risk from the very real danger of roof collapse under the growing weight of ash and pumice, and evidence of this kind of death has been found in several excavated buildings. Others made the decision to flee, gathering whatever belongings they could carry, and heading out through the town's gates in the hope of escaping to safer ground, particularly toward the coast, where they may have hoped to secure passage on a boat away from the immediate area entirely. Skeletal remains found along the beach south of Pompeii, near what would have been the ancient shoreline, suggest that a considerable number of people gathered there, whether waiting for boats that couldn't safely approach through the increasingly rough, ash-choked waters, or trying to decide on their best remaining option as conditions around them continued to deteriorate. It's worth pausing to note, honestly and carefully, that this initial phase of pumice fall, however frightening and disruptive, was not actually the deadliest part of the eruption for most of Pompeii's eventual victims. Many people likely survived this stage of the disaster, some fleeing successfully, others sheltering through it, before facing the far more sudden and far more lethal events still to come. Herculaneum, a different fate while Pompeii endured this steady, hours-long accumulation of falling pumice. The smaller coastal town of Herculaneum, positioned closer to the mountain itself, but on its opposite, more sheltered side, experienced the eruption quite differently, due largely to wind direction carrying most of the initial ashfall away from it and toward Pompeii instead. For much of that first day, residents of Herculaneum may have felt, with grim and ultimately mistaken relief, that they had been spared the worst of it. Some tremors, some falling ash, certainly, but nothing on the scale of what was burying Pompeii a few miles away. This apparent reprieve, tragically, would not last. Herculaneum's fate arrived not through hours of gradually accumulating pumice, but through a much faster, far more violent mechanism: pyroclastic surges and flows, superheated avalanches of ash, gas, and volcanic debris that raced down the mountain's slopes at speeds that could exceed 100 miles per hour, with internal temperatures hot enough to instantly and fatally affect anyone in their path. The first of these surges reached Herculaneum in the later hours of the eruption, and evidence uncovered by archaeologists, including a large number of skeletons found clustered together in boat chambers along what was once the town's shoreline, suggests that many residents had gathered there, likely hoping for rescue by sea, only to be overtaken before any escape could occur. The scientific study of these remains, conducted with considerable care and respect over recent decades, has revealed a great deal about the specific mechanism of death in these pyroclastic events, information that, while genuinely difficult, has proven scientifically valuable for understanding volcanic hazards that remain relevant to communities living near active volcanoes even today. It's a sobering reminder that the story of Pompeii and Herculaneum isn't only an ancient tragedy preserved in curious detail. It's also, in a very real sense, an ongoing lesson still being studied by scientists working to protect the millions of people who live in the shadow of active volcanoes around the world right now. Pompeii itself would soon face its own version of these pyroclastic flows, though it would take slightly longer to arrive there than it did at Herculaneum, due to the greater distance between the town and the mountain's summit. Pliny the Elder sails toward the mountain across the bay at Misenum. Pliny the Elder, commander of the Roman fleet, watched the strange cloud rising from Vesuvius with the curiosity of a lifelong scholar, rather than the caution of a man sensing danger. He had spent much of his life gathering knowledge for what would become his sprawling encyclopedic work, The Natural History, and a phenomenon this unusual was, to him, simply too interesting to observe from a comfortable distance. According to his nephew's later account, Pliny the Elder initially ordered a light vessel prepared so he could sail closer and study the eruption directly. Before he could depart, however, he received an urgent message from a woman named Rectina, whose villa lay near the base of the mountain, in a location that offered no escape by land, since the roads were already becoming impassable. She begged for rescue by sea. Pliny, in response, changed his plan entirely, ordering larger warships prepared instead, no longer setting out purely as an observer, but now as a rescuer, intending to bring aid to as many stranded coastal residents as his fleet could manage. This detail matters enormously to how we understand him, because it transforms his story from simple scientific curiosity into something closer to genuine courage. As his ships approached the coast, falling ash and pumice grew thick enough that his helmsman urged turning back, but Pliny reportedly insisted they continue, telling those around him that fortune favors the brave, and directing the fleet toward the villa of a friend named Pomponianus at Stabii, a coastal town a few miles south of Pompeii itself, since a shift in wind made direct approach to the worst affected areas near Herculaneum impossible. At Pomponianus's villa, Pliny the Elder reportedly remained remarkably composed, even resting and dining calmly, while ash continued falling outside, apparently in a deliberate effort to reassure the frightened household around him. Sometime in the night or early the following morning, conditions worsened to the point that the household decided to leave the building, tying pillows over their heads with cloths for makeshift protection against falling debris, and heading toward the shore in hopes of escaping by sea, only to find the water too rough and the wind too unfavorable for departure. Pliny the Elder died on that shoreline, according to his nephew's account, apparently from complications related to the toxic gases and ash in the air, worsened by his own physical condition, since he was described as a heavyset man with some pre-existing breathing difficulty. His body was reportedly found afterward, undamaged externally, appearing, in his nephew's words, more like a man sleeping than one who had died in the middle of catastrophe. His death remains one of history's earliest and most famous examples of a scientist dying in direct pursuit of understanding a natural phenomenon, and his nephew's detailed written account of these events remains, to this day, one of our only surviving eyewitness records of the entire eruption. The column falls sometime in the early hours of the second day, according to the geological and archaeological evidence pieced together over generations of study. The eruption entered its most violently destructive phase, one that would ultimately determine the specific, terrible fate of Pompeii itself. The tall eruption column that had been sustaining itself for many hours, continuously feeding ash and pumice down onto Pompeii and the surrounding countryside, eventually became too heavy and unstable to maintain its own height. When a volcanic column collapses in this way, rather than simply dissipating harmlessly, it instead falls back down onto the volcano's slopes, generating exactly the kind of pyroclastic flows and surges that had already devastated Herculaneum hours earlier. These fast-moving currents of superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments swept outward from the mountain with tremendous speed, and by this point in the eruption, they had begun reaching Pompeii as well. Multiple distinct pyroclastic surges struck the town over the following hours, each one leaving its own identifiable layer in the geological record that archaeologists can still read today, almost like pages in a terrible book. Some residents who had survived the earlier hours of pumice fall by sheltering indoors, or who had delayed their attempt to flee for whatever reason, were caught by these surges. The extreme heat involved in these events, estimated by researchers based on studies of skeletal and other physical evidence to have reached several hundred degrees, would have caused death within moments for those directly exposed, a mercy of speed within an otherwise unimaginable event. It's worth being honest here about something that modern research has clarified, correcting an older, more dramatic popular assumption. For many years, the famous plaster casts of Pompeii's victims, twisted into expressive, agonized postures, were sometimes interpreted as evidence of slow, painful deaths by suffocation under accumulating ash. More recent studies of skeletal remains, however, including analysis of bone coloration consistent with intense heat exposure, along with studies of muscle contraction patterns consistent with the sudden, violent contraction caused by extreme heat rather than prolonged struggle, suggest that death for most victims of these later pyroclastic events was likely very rapid, a small, genuine comfort within an otherwise deeply sobering chapter of this story. The last of Pompeii, by the time the eruption finally began to subside, Pompeii had been buried under an estimated 12 to 20 feet of pumice, ash, and volcanic debris, depending on location within the town. Roofs had collapsed. Streets had vanished beneath the accumulated layers. The town's outline itself, from any distance, would have been unrecognizable, an eerie, gray moonscape-like mound where a living community had stood just a day, or perhaps a day and a half before. We don't know with any real certainty how many of Pompeii's residents died in the disaster versus how many managed to escape successfully in the hours before the worst pyroclastic surges arrived. Estimates for the town's total population run anywhere from around 11,000, and the number of bodies or body-shaped voids recovered by archaeologists over more than 2.5 centuries of excavation numbers in the low thousands, a discrepancy that strongly suggests a considerable portion of the population did, in fact, manage to escape, likely during the initial hours of pumice fall, before conditions became truly lethal. This is a detail worth sitting with, because popular imagination often assumes that everyone in Pompeii died that day, when the more accurate, and in some ways more hopeful, picture is that many residents survived, fleeing with whatever they could carry, likely losing their homes, their businesses, and in many cases family members and neighbors, but living on afterward to rebuild their lives elsewhere in the Roman world. Their personal stories of survival simply never recorded for us to find, since history, unfortunately, tends to remember catastrophe far more thoroughly than it remembers quiet, ordinary recovery. For those who did not escape, though, their final moments were preserved in a way that exists almost nowhere else in the historical or archaeological record, and it's to that remarkable, strange method of preservation that we'll turn next. The shapes left behind one of the most remarkable and most quietly heartbreaking aspects of Pompeii's story involves a discovery made not in the first years of excavation, but more than a century and a half after digging began at the site. When people and animals died and were buried under falling ash during the eruption, their bodies gradually decomposed over the following years and decades, leaving behind hollow, body-shaped voids within the now hardened volcanic material surrounding them, since the ash had compacted and solidified around their forms before decomposition ever began. For a long time, excavators simply encountered these voids as strange, empty cavities in the ground, often without fully understanding what they represented, and sometimes damaging or destroying them accidentally during the digging process. In the 1860s, an Italian archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli, who took over direction of the excavations and introduced many of the more careful, systematic methods still used at the site today, realized what these cavities actually were and developed an ingenious technique for recovering them. By carefully drilling into a suspected void and pouring liquid plaster inside, allowing it to fill and harden within the cavity before excavating the surrounding ash away entirely, Fiorelli was able to create astonishingly detailed casts capturing the exact final posture, clothing folds, and even facial expressions of people and animals at the precise moment of their death, nearly 18 centuries earlier. These plaster casts remain some of the most emotionally powerful artifacts recovered from anywhere in the ancient world. Among them are figures who appear to be embracing one another. A dog, still wearing its collar, twisted in what appears to have been a desperate final struggle, having apparently been chained and unable to escape. The group that has become known, somewhat informally, as the family in the garden, believed to include a mother, father, and children, found together in postures suggesting they had huddled together in their final moments. It's worth being careful and honest about how much we can truly know from body posture alone regarding the specific relationships or exact final thoughts of these individuals, since it's genuinely tempting, understandably, to project a complete emotional narrative onto physical evidence that can only tell us so much with certainty. But it's equally true that these casts collapse the distance of nearly 2,000 years almost instantly, transforming abstract historical statistics into individual, deeply felt human presences in a way remarkably few other archaeological discoveries anywhere in the world are capable of doing. More recent casting techniques, using clear resin rather than plaster, have allowed researchers to study skeletal remains inside the casts without destroying the outer shape, revealing further details about diet, health, and even dental condition among Pompeii's final residents, adding still more layers of understanding to figures whose outer forms had already told us so much. Silence for 17 centuries after the eruption finally ended, the region around Vesuvius did not remain entirely abandoned, though the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum themselves effectively vanished from active use and, eventually, from common memory. Survivors, understandably, largely did not return to rebuild directly atop the buried ruins, since the ground itself had been reshaped so dramatically that the original town layout was no longer visible or accessible in any practical sense. Some looting did occur in the years immediately following the disaster, with organized digging tunnels found by later archaeologists cutting directly through certain buildings, apparently created by people who returned specifically to recover valuables from beneath the ash, sometimes guided by knowledge of where wealthy homes had once stood. Over subsequent decades and centuries, the exact location and even the name of Pompeii gradually faded from active regional knowledge, though it was never entirely forgotten in written sources, since ancient authors, including Pliny the Younger himself, had documented its destruction. Local farmers in the following centuries continued cultivating the extremely fertile soil that had resulted from the volcanic deposits, occasionally turning up ancient walls, coins, or fragments of pottery without necessarily understanding the full scale of what lay buried beneath their fields. The town remained essentially undisturbed and unexcavated for close to 1,700 years, an almost unimaginable span of time during which entire civilizations rose and fell elsewhere in the world, while Pompeii itself sat quietly beneath layers of hardened ash and pumice, waiting, in a manner of speaking, though of course a buried town cannot truly wait for anything. It would take the curiosity of 18th-century excavators, initially motivated more by treasure hunting than genuine scholarly interest, to finally bring the town back into the light. Rediscovery, the formal rediscovery of the buried cities, actually began not at Pompeii itself, but at Herculaneum in the early 1700s, when workers digging a well accidentally struck ancient marble, leading to early, fairly haphazard excavation efforts sponsored by local nobility interested primarily in recovering valuable statues and decorative items for private collections, rather than in careful archaeological documentation as we would understand that term today. Pompeii's own more systematic rediscovery began in 1748 under the sponsorship of King Charles of Bourbon, who ruled the Kingdom of Naples at the time. Early excavation methods here, too, prioritized the recovery of impressive, valuable artifacts, sometimes at the direct expense of preserving broader archaeological context, with many of the finest early discoveries transported directly to royal collections rather than left in place or thoroughly documented within their original setting. Word of these discoveries gradually spread throughout Europe over the following decades, and Pompeii became an essential stop on the Grand Tour, the extended educational travels that wealthy young Europeans, particularly from Britain, undertook as a capstone to their classical education. Visiting the excavated ruins of an actual, tangible Roman town, rather than simply reading about ancient Rome in a book, had a genuinely profound effect on European art, architecture, and design during this period, contributing significantly to the neoclassical style that came to dominate fashionable buildings, furniture, and decorative arts across much of Europe, and eventually the young United States as well. It wasn't until later in the 19th century, particularly under the direction of Giuseppe Fiorelli beginning in 1863, that excavation at Pompeii became genuinely systematic and scientifically rigorous by the standards of the time. Fiorelli introduced careful, sequential excavation of the site by defined regions and blocks, meticulous documentation of exactly where artifacts were found, and as we discussed earlier, the technique for creating plaster casts of victims. His methods established a foundation that, refined considerably through subsequent generations of archaeological practice, still guides work at the site today, more than a century and a half later. Walking through the house of the Faun among the many houses uncovered at Pompeii over the centuries, a few stand out as genuinely extraordinary, offering a window into just how wealthy and cultured certain segments of the town's population truly were. The House of the Faun, named for a small bronze statue of a dancing faun found within its central atrium, ranks among the largest private residences ever excavated from the ancient Roman world, occupying nearly an entire city block. Its floors included elaborate mosaics of extraordinary skill, most famously a large depiction of Alexander the Great in battle against the Persian king Darius, likely copied from a lost Hellenistic Greek painting, rendered here using an astonishing number of tiny colored stone and glass tesserae, each individually placed to create shading, depth, and expression that still impresses specialists studying ancient art today. The scale and quality of this house tells us something important about Pompeii that's easy to overlook if we focus only on its ordinary bakeries and modest shop fronts. This was a town wealthy enough to support residents with the resources, taste, and cultural ambition to commission artwork on par with anything found in Rome itself, or in the greater cultural centers of the Hellenistic Greek world that so heavily influenced Roman aesthetic taste during this period. Elsewhere in town, the Villa of the Mysteries, actually located just outside Pompeii's main walls, contains one of the most discussed and debated fresco cycles from the entire ancient world, a series of large, vividly painted figures set against a deep red background, apparently depicting some kind of ritual initiation, possibly connected to the worship of the god Dionysus. Scholars continue to genuinely disagree about the precise meaning and narrative sequence of these images, whether they depict an actual religious initiation ceremony, a mythological scene, or some combination of both, and this uncertainty itself is worth acknowledging honestly rather than presenting a false sense of settled interpretation where none actually exists among the people who study this material most closely. What surprised even the excavators' certain discoveries at Pompeii have continued, generation after generation, to genuinely surprise the people doing the digging, revealing details about Roman life that written sources from the period simply never bothered to mention, since ancient authors, understandably, rarely felt the need to describe things that seemed too obvious or mundane to write down. The sheer number and explicitness of sexual imagery found throughout Pompeii, for instance, startled its 18th and 19th century excavators considerably, appearing not just in what we might expect to be private, discreet contexts, but openly in shops, bathhouses, and even along public streets. A significant collection of this material was eventually removed from general display and placed into what became known as the Secret Cabinet, a restricted collection in the Naples Archaeological Museum that remained largely inaccessible to ordinary visitors for well over a century, reflecting the far more conservative sensibilities of the era doing the excavating rather than anything unusual about Roman attitudes themselves. Modern scholars generally understand this imagery as reflecting a Roman culture with a considerably more open, and in some contexts almost casual, relationship to sexuality and fertility symbolism than many later European societies would maintain, though it's worth being careful not to overstate this either, since plenty of evidence also points to strict social and legal codes governing acceptable behavior, particularly for women and for those without full citizen status. Elsewhere, excavators have been surprised by the sophistication of Pompeii's plumbing and water distribution systems, fed by an aqueduct connecting to a larger regional water supply network, with lead pipes distributing water throughout the town to public fountains, private homes, and the bath complexes we discussed earlier. The engineering skill involved here, achieved without any of the mathematical or material tools we take for granted today, continues to genuinely impress modern engineers studying the site. Perhaps most surprising of all, to many casual visitors encountering Pompeii for the first time, is simply how thoroughly ordinary so much of it turns out to be. Beyond the grand villas and famous artworks, most of Pompeii consisted of modest homes, small shops, and narrow, practical streets, the everyday architecture of everyday people, preserved not because anyone intended it to be preserved, but purely by the accident of catastrophe. In a strange way, Pompeii's greatest historical value may lie precisely in this ordinariness, since so much of what survives from the ancient world otherwise comes from monuments, temples, and elite literature specifically created to be remembered, while Pompeii accidentally preserved the parts of ancient life that nobody at the time thought worth writing down. Myths worth setting aside before we bring this story toward its close. It's worth spending a little time gently correcting a few popular misconceptions about Pompeii that have taken root over the centuries, since separating established evidence from enduring myth is part of treating this history, and the people who actually lived it, with proper respect. One persistent myth holds that Pompeii's residents had no warning at all, and were caught completely by surprise in a single sudden instant. As we've discussed, the reality was more layered than that. The eruption unfolded over many hours, beginning with a lengthy period of falling pumice that gave a meaningful number of residents time to flee, even though the final, most lethal phase did arrive with sudden, overwhelming speed for those who remained. Another common misunderstanding involves the plaster casts themselves, sometimes mistakenly described in older popular accounts as containing actual preserved skin or flesh. In truth, the casts capture only the negative space, the void, left behind after the body's soft tissue decomposed, filled afterward with plaster, though the underlying skeletal remains are sometimes still present within the cast itself, as more recent scanning technology has helped confirm in considerable detail. A further popular myth suggests that Pompeii was a uniquely decadent or morally exceptional city, somehow singled out or deserving of its fate in some larger cosmic sense, an interpretation with roots stretching back to certain religiously inflected reactions when the site was first widely publicized in the 18th and 19th centuries. Modern historians generally reject this framing entirely, understanding Pompeii instead as a genuinely ordinary provincial Roman town, its social customs, religious practices, and daily habits broadly consistent with countless other communities throughout the Roman world at the time, simply preserved by geological accident rather than singled out by any particular moral distinction. Finally, it's worth gently noting that Vesuvius itself remains an active volcano today, closely monitored by Italian scientists, situated uncomfortably close to the modern, densely populated city of Naples and its surrounding suburbs, home now to considerably more people than lived in the entire Bay of Naples region during Roman times. This isn't meant to end our evening on an anxious note, but rather as a quiet reminder that the story of Pompeii isn't purely a closed chapter from the distant past. It remains, in a very real sense, a living scientific concern, studied partly out of historical curiosity and partly out of genuine, practical necessity for the safety of people living in that region right now. Modern EYES on an ancient town in recent years, archaeological work at Pompeii has entered something of a new golden age, driven by a major, ongoing conservation and research initiative often referred to as the Great Pompeii Project, along with steadily improving scientific technology that allows researchers to extract far more information from the site than earlier generations of excavators could have imagined possible. DNA analysis, for instance, has recently allowed researchers to examine genetic material recovered from some of the plaster casts themselves, occasionally revealing information that complicates long-assumed interpretations. In one notable case, a cast long popularly described as a mother and child, based purely on their physical positioning relative to one another, was found through genetic testing to actually be two individuals with no biological relationship at all, quite possibly two males rather than the mother and child pairing assumed for generations. This kind of finding is a genuinely valuable, humbling reminder that even our most emotionally resonant interpretations of the past deserve to be held with some humility, open to correction as better evidence becomes available, rather than treated as settled fact simply because a particular story feels compelling or familiar. Advanced imaging technology, including CT scanning, has allowed researchers to study the skeletal remains within certain casts without any physical damage to the cast itself, revealing details about individual health, diet, dental condition, and even, in some cases, evidence of past injuries or illnesses that these individuals lived with during their lifetimes. Isotopic analysis of bone and dental material has offered clues about individual diets, sometimes suggesting that certain residents had eaten diets richer in seafood or grain or specific regional foods than others, adding further texture to our understanding of social and economic variation within the town. Excavation continues, even now in previously unexplored sections of the site, particularly in the northern Regio 5 area, where relatively recent digging has uncovered remarkably well-preserved frescoes, additional skeletal remains, and everyday objects that continue adding new, small pieces to our understanding of Pompeii's final days. It's a genuinely remarkable thing to consider. A town destroyed nearly 2,000 years ago is still, quite literally, being discovered anew, one careful excavation season at a time, and researchers estimate that a meaningful portion of the ancient town remains unexcavated even today, deliberately left untouched partly to preserve material for future generations equipped with even more advanced, less invasive research techniques than we currently possess. Families, neighbors, and the people in between it's worth returning, gently, to the human scale of this story before we bring the evening toward its close, because it's easy when discussing archaeology and volcanology to lose sight of the fact that Pompeii was, above everything else, a community of real families and real neighbors, bound together by the same complicated mixture of affection, obligation, rivalry, and routine that holds any community together. Roman family structure centered around the paterfamilias, the eldest living male head of household, who held considerable legal authority over his wife, children, and any enslaved members of the household, at least in formal legal terms, though the practical, day-to-day reality of family life was surely softer and more negotiated than strict legal definitions alone would suggest, much as it tends to be in any household, in any era. Marriage among Roman citizens was typically arranged, particularly among wealthier families, where marriage often served important social, political, or economic purposes, though surviving letters and inscriptions from across the Roman world make clear that genuine affection frequently developed within these arranged unions, sometimes described in surprisingly tender terms on funerary monuments commemorating a beloved spouse. Neighbors in Pompeii lived in close physical proximity, sharing walls, alleyways, and public spaces in ways that surely generated both genuine community bonds and, inevitably, occasional friction, much of which survives for us today in the form of graffiti complaints, property boundary disputes recorded in legal documents, and small architectural adjustments made over time as buildings were modified, subdivided, or expanded to accommodate changing family circumstances. Freed slaves, known as freedmen, occupied a genuinely interesting and somewhat unique social position within Pompeii's community, no longer enslaved but not carrying quite the same full social status as freeborn citizens, though many freedmen in Pompeii clearly achieved considerable financial success, particularly in trade and commerce, sometimes surpassing the wealth of freeborn citizens from less fortunate families. The banker Caecilius Eucundus, mentioned earlier in connection with the earthquake relief carving, is believed by some scholars to have descended from a freedman family, and his household's evident prosperity offers a useful reminder that Roman social status, while certainly rigid and consequential in many respects, still allowed for genuine social and economic mobility within certain bounds, particularly across successive generations. The baker, one last time let's return, before we close this evening's story, to Modestus, the baker whose bread was rising in the dark hours before dawn when we first met him at the very beginning of this journey together. We don't know with any real certainty exactly what became of him personally, whether he escaped the town successfully in those first hours of falling pumice, whether he stayed behind trying to protect his shop and his ovens, or whether he simply never had the chance to make that choice at all. What we do know, because the physical evidence of his bakery survived so remarkably intact, is that on the morning we began this story, he baked bread the same way he had baked it for years, stamped with his own maker's mark, set carefully into his oven exactly as he had done countless mornings before. There's something quietly moving in the fact that this small, unremarkable act, so completely ordinary that Modestus himself surely gave it no particular thought that morning, became one of the tiny fragments through which we now understand an entire vanished world. He wasn't trying to leave a message for the future. He was simply making bread, the way people have made bread across countless mornings and countless cultures throughout the long history of human life, entirely unaware that his particular morning would become the one that outlasted so many others, preserved by an accident of geology rather than any intention of his own. This, in the end, might be the truest lesson Pompeii has to offer us gently, without needing to be stated too dramatically. Most of what any of us do in our daily lives, we do without any thought of being remembered. We make bread, we mend hems, we argue with neighbors and reconcile with them. We raise children and worry about money and complain, sometimes about the small inconveniences of an ordinary day. History so often remembers only the grand and the famous, but Pompeii, through nothing but sheer accident, chose instead to preserve the small and the ordinary, and in doing so, it gave those small, ordinary lives a kind of permanence that even emperors and generals rarely receive. The sound of night in Pompeii let's slow down again for a moment, drifting back in memory to an ordinary night in Pompeii, sometime before the eruption, simply to feel what the town sounded like once darkness fell and the busy noise of the daytime streets gradually faded away. Without street lighting in any form we'd recognize today, Pompeii's nights were genuinely dark, lit only by whatever oil lamps individual households chose to keep burning, their small, flickering flames casting soft pools of orange light through doorways and window openings, and by whatever moonlight happened to be available on a given evening. Wealthier households might send an enslaved attendant ahead with a torch to light the way home from a dinner party, since walking Pompeii's uneven, unlit streets after dark carried real, practical risk of a stumble or a fall. Nighttime sounds would have included the distant bark of dogs, the occasional creak of a cart still making a late delivery, and drifting from certain establishments still open after dark, the murmur of conversation and laughter from taverns and inns catering to travelers, sailors, and locals looking for a late meal or a cup of wine before heading home. Some of Pompeii's inns, called copani, offered lodging as well as food and drink, catering particularly to travelers arriving too late in the day to continue their journey, or to those simply looking for company and conversation away from the more formal, structured setting of a private home. In the quieter residential streets, meanwhile, the sound of night would have settled into something gentler. The soft creak of wooden shutters, the occasional cry of an infant somewhere down the block, the low murmur of a family finishing a late meal together in the warm, flickering light of their own household lamps. Cicadas and crickets, so loud during the heat of the day, would have quieted somewhat after dark, replaced by the softer sounds of night birds and occasionally the distant lowing of livestock kept in courtyards or small stables attached to wealthier homes. It's a small, gentle image to hold on to, this quiet, ordinary town settling into sleep beneath a starlit Campanian sky, its residents entirely unaware of what the mountain above them was quietly preparing. Women's lives in Pompeii Roman society, including in a town like Pompeii, placed considerable legal and social limitations on women, who generally could not vote, hold public office, or exercise full independent legal authority in the way male citizens could. And yet the actual lived reality of women's lives in Pompeii, as revealed through inscriptions, property records, and archaeological evidence, turns out to be considerably more varied and, in certain respects, more independent than these formal legal restrictions alone might suggest. Perhaps the most striking example is a Pompeian woman named Eumatia, a wealthy priestess and businesswoman whose family had made its fortune in the wool and textile trade, one of the town's most economically important industries. Eumatia funded the construction of a substantial public building near the Forum, a large structure that likely served functions related to the wool trade and possibly broader civic purposes as well, and she had it dedicated formally in her own name, with an inscription crediting her personally as its patron, a genuinely notable public honor for any Roman citizen, let alone a woman, in a society that generally reserved this kind of public commemoration for prominent men. Other surviving evidence points to women running businesses of their own throughout Pompeii, including at least one notable case of a woman who appears to have operated a thriving business selling and trading various goods, her name appearing repeatedly on wax tablet financial records recovered from a nearby town with similarly well-preserved archives. Women also appear as property owners, as active participants in Pompeii's vigorous graffiti culture, leaving behind their own personal messages, complaints, and declarations right alongside those left by men, and as devoted, active practitioners of household and civic religious life, particularly connected to the worship of goddesses like Venus, Ceres, and Isis, the last of which, as mentioned earlier, enjoyed particular popularity in Pompeii thanks to its own dedicated temple. None of this should suggest that Pompeii represented anything close to a modern understanding of gender equality, since the formal legal and social framework still constrained women considerably compared to their male counterparts. But it's a useful, humanizing correction to any overly simplistic assumption that Roman women lived lives of total confinement and invisibility, when the actual evidence points to individual women navigating, and in some genuinely impressive cases thriving within, a restrictive system through business acumen, religious leadership, and social influence exercised in whatever channels were actually available to them. Trade, money, and everyday economics. Pompeii's economy, though modest by the standards of Rome itself, was genuinely sophisticated, integrated tightly into the broader commercial networks that bound the Roman Mediterranean together into something resembling, in certain respects, an early version of an interconnected trading economy. Coinage circulated widely throughout the town, with bronze coins used for everyday small transactions, like a loaf of bread or a cup of wine, while silver and gold coins handled larger purchases and business transactions. Banking of a sort existed as well, with individuals like Caecilius Eucundus, whom we've mentioned a few times now, operating essentially as a financial intermediary, arranging loans, handling auctions, and recording detailed transactions on wax tablets, a substantial number of which survived remarkably well, giving historians an unusually detailed window into the practical, day-to-day financial life of a Roman provincial town. Trade guilds called collegia organized workers within particular professions, from bakers to fullers to various craft trades, providing a sense of professional identity and mutual support, somewhat comparable in certain limited respects to how professional associations, or in some cases, ancient equivalents of labor organizations might function, though it's worth being careful not to overstate the comparison. Since these Roman associations also carried significant religious and social functions, quite different from purely modern trade unions. Real estate, too, formed an important part of Pompeii's economy, with wealthier residents often owning multiple properties, renting out shop spaces along the street-facing portions of their larger homes to tenant merchants and craftspeople, a practical arrangement that generated steady rental income while allowing the property owner to maintain their own private residence in the quieter, more secluded portions of the same building, set back from the noise and traffic of the street itself. Taxation, too, connected Pompeii's local economy to the much larger administrative machinery of the Roman Empire, with various taxes and duties supporting both local civic projects and the broader imperial government based in Rome, a genuinely complex system of financial obligation that most residents likely thought about only when directly required to, much the way most people today think about taxes primarily around the times they're actually due. Death, memory, and what came after life. Roman attitudes toward death and the afterlife varied considerably, and it's worth spending a little time here, gently, exploring what people in Pompeii likely believed about what happened after this life ended, since it adds an important layer of context to everything that followed on the day of the eruption itself. Traditional Roman religion offered a somewhat vague, not especially comforting vision of the afterlife, centered around the underworld ruled by Pluto, where the shades of the dead existed in a kind of dim, shadowy continuation of existence, neither a place of reward nor of punishment in any developed sense, at least within the earlier, more traditional Roman religious framework. Funerary practices focused heavily, therefore, on the practical, earthly matter of memory and commemoration, since ensuring that the dead were properly remembered by the living carried enormous cultural weight, arguably more emotional weight, for many Romans than any specific belief about a literal afterlife destination. Tombs lining the roads leading into Pompeii, a common Roman practice of placing burial monuments along major roadways outside town walls, carried inscriptions specifically designed to keep the deceased's name and memory alive in the minds of passers-by, sometimes including surprisingly direct, personal messages asking travelers to pause, read the inscription aloud, and thereby extend the deceased's memory just a little further through the simple act of a stranger speaking their name. By the 1st century, however, newer religious movements imported from the Eastern Mediterranean, including the cult of Isis mentioned earlier, along with various mystery religions promising more personal, direct engagement with divine forces and clearer promises regarding a meaningful afterlife, had begun genuinely competing with, and in some households supplementing, traditional Roman religious practice. It's worth noting, too, that early Christian communities existed elsewhere in the Roman world by this period, though there's no solid archaeological or documentary evidence establishing a confirmed Christian presence specifically within Pompeii itself, despite some romanticized, less rigorously supported claims occasionally made in more popular retellings of the town's story. What's genuinely striking, and worth sitting with quietly, is how the eruption itself created something like an entirely unintended, accidental form of memorial for so many of Pompeii's residents, preserving their final moments, and in many cases, their very last physical postures in a manner far more vivid and immediate than any funerary inscription could ever have achieved, even though nothing about their deaths was ever meant to serve as a monument for future generations to study. Why this story still matters as our evening together begins drawing toward its close, it's worth asking, gently, why a town destroyed nearly 2,000 years ago continues to hold such a powerful grip on modern imagination, drawing millions of visitors to its excavated ruins every single year, and inspiring countless books, documentaries, and quiet late-night videos just like this one. Part of the answer, surely, lies in the sheer completeness of what survived. Unlike most ancient sites, worn away gradually over centuries by weather, reuse, and deliberate demolition, Pompeii was sealed almost instantly, preserving not just grand monuments but genuinely everyday details. A half-eaten meal, a child's toy, graffiti scratched by someone we'll never otherwise know anything about, a baker's stamped loaf still sitting in its oven. This completeness gives us something history rarely offers, not just facts about the past, but a genuine, tangible sense of its lived, breathing texture. Part of the answer, too, lies in the emotional weight of the plaster cast specifically, those haunting captured postures that transform abstract historical tragedy into something intimately, unavoidably human. It's one thing to read a number, however large, describing casualties from an ancient disaster. It's another thing entirely to see the actual, physical shape of a person's final moment of shelter, curled protectively, we assume, around someone they loved. And perhaps part of the answer lies simply in the universal, deeply relatable nature of an ordinary morning interrupted by catastrophe, a theme that resonates across every era of human history, since none of us, in any century, truly know which of our own ordinary mornings might turn out to be quietly extraordinary in ways we can't yet see coming. Pompeii's residents woke up that day thinking about bread, about debts, about the heat, about their families and their small daily concerns, exactly the way most of us wake up most mornings of our own lives. Their story reminds us, without needing to be dramatic about it, that ordinary life and historical significance are not actually separate categories. They're simply the same thing, viewed from different distances in time. The objects they carried among the most quietly moving discoveries at Pompeii are the small, personal items found near the bodies of those who did not survive, since these objects often reveal, with startling intimacy, exactly what a person considered valuable enough to grab in their final desperate moments. In several excavated locations, archaeologists have found clusters of jewelry, coins, and small valuables gathered together near a body, suggesting a person had taken the time, even amid the chaos and falling ash, to collect their most precious or financially important possessions before attempting to flee. In one case, a set of surgical instruments was found near the remains of a man believed to have been a physician, his professional tools apparently kept close even in his final moments, whether out of habit, practical necessity, or simply the instinct to hold onto the tools of one's trade and identity, even in the face of overwhelming crisis. Keys, too, appear surprisingly often among recovered artifacts, a small, deeply relatable detail, since it suggests that even amid catastrophic upheaval, people held onto the practical, everyday assumption that they would eventually be returning home, locking up a house they still, on some level, expected to see again. Purses containing coins, small collections of gold jewelry, including rings, bracelets, and earrings, and in a few notable instances, sealed documents and financial records, have all been found clutched near or wrapped protectively around the remains of individuals who clearly understood, at least in their final conscious moments, that these particular objects mattered enough to try to save. There's something worth sitting with in this detail, gently, without needing to overstate its emotional weight. These weren't people preparing for a symbolic historical event. They were simply doing what any of us might do if forced to leave our homes in a genuine hurry, grabbing money, important documents, cherished jewelry, whatever felt most essential in an impossibly short window of time to decide. Their instincts, preserved now for almost 2,000 years, feel remarkably, sometimes almost uncomfortably, familiar. The roads out of town for those residents of Pompeii who chose to flee rather than shelter in place. Several roads led away from the town toward the surrounding countryside and coast, and archaeological and geological evidence has allowed researchers to reconstruct, with reasonable confidence, some of the likely routes and challenges facing anyone attempting escape. The road leading south toward Stabii and the coast offered one potential escape route, away from the mountain itself, though as we discussed earlier in connection with Pliny the Elder's ill-fated rescue attempt, sea conditions during the eruption made escape by boat difficult, and in many cases impossible, due to rough water and unfavorable winds pushing against any vessel trying to depart. Roads leading toward Nuceria and other inland towns offered another possible route, away from the coast entirely, though these paths would have required traveling through the same increasingly hazardous conditions of falling ash and pumice that were affecting the wider region, not just Pompeii itself. Visibility during the height of the ashfall would have been severely limited, with accounts from Pliny the Younger describing conditions across the bay at Misenum, mentioning darkness so complete that people could not see their own hands in front of their faces, needing to feel their way forward or follow the sound of others' voices to avoid becoming separated in the chaos. If conditions across the bay, considerably farther from the mountain, were this severe, we can reasonably assume conditions immediately around Pompeii itself, so much closer to the eruption, would have been at least as difficult, likely considerably more so. Given these severe practical challenges, it's genuinely remarkable and worth appreciating fully that a meaningful portion of Pompeii's population did manage to escape successfully, navigating disorienting darkness, falling debris, and general panic, using nothing more than whatever knowledge of the local roads they'd built up over years of ordinary daily life, now suddenly repurposed for the entirely extraordinary task of survival. Let's return one final time to where we began this evening together. A baker waking in the dark hours before dawn, an oven being carefully checked and stoked, a dog stretching near the doorway, waiting patiently for scraps, a mountain, green and quiet, sitting peacefully against a paling summer sky, exactly as it had sat for as long as anyone could remember. We now know, of course, everything that particular morning could not have known about itself. We know about the pumice that would soon begin falling, about Pliny the Elder's brave, ultimately fatal voyage across the bay, about the pyroclastic surges that would eventually overtake both Herculaneum and Pompeii, about the plaster casts that would one day give shape and presence to people whose names, in most cases, history simply never recorded. We know, too, about the 17 centuries of silence that followed, and about the slow, patient work of archaeologists who gradually brought this vanished town back into the light, one careful excavation season at a time. But on that particular morning, none of this had happened yet. There was only bread rising in the dark, and a town slowly waking up around it, filled with people thinking about entirely ordinary things. Debts, meals, arguments, small hopes, small worries, the particular quality of the summer heat. It's tempting, looking back from where we now stand, to search their story for some hidden warning sign they should have noticed, some clue that should have told them what was coming. But the deeper truth, and perhaps the more valuable one, is simply this: they lived their lives the way all of us live ours, mostly unaware of what any particular day actually holds, trusting reasonably that tomorrow will resemble today. Pompeii's mountain eventually settled back into stillness after the eruption ended, and life, in various quiet, scattered ways, gradually continued around it, in nearby towns, among survivors who rebuilt elsewhere, and eventually among the countless generations of visitors, scholars, and curious travelers who would come to stand where that town once stood, trying to understand something true about people who lived so long ago, yet remain, in so many small ways, remarkably like us. If you've stayed with this story all the way to its quiet end, thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I hope it gave you exactly the kind of calm, unhurried company you were looking for. Wherever you are, and whatever time it happens to be where you're listening from, I hope you rest well tonight, gently carried off perhaps by the thought of an ordinary morning, long ago, in a town that the world would spend the next 2,000 years slowly learning to remember. Sleep well.